Nelson Appleton Miles is one of the most underappreciated and yet significant American military commanders of the 19th century. Miles had an incredible career starting from a very young age. He was only in his early 20s when the Civil War broke out, and yet he helped raise a unit, ultimately won the Medal of Honor for his actions at Chancellorsville, and then became a commander during the Indian Wars after the Civil War, and became the leader of the U.S. Army as the Army prepared for the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century. We have an incredible amount of items from Miles' career here before me, as well as some items related to this incredible Winchester 1895 that was presented to him. The first item we're going to discuss here is this beautiful presentation sword given to Miles by the men of the 61st New York Volunteers during the Civil War. Unlike many of the commanding generals of the American Civil War, Miles was not a West Point graduate. He actually was self-educated in military history, and he studied at night after working as a clerk in Boston. He raised funds to raise a company, but was deemed too young to serve as their captain, instead started off as a lieutenant. Nonetheless, he quickly proved himself on the battlefield and rose rapidly through the ranks. Miles was wounded several times during the Civil War. His most serious wound came while leading the 61st New York at the Battle of Chancellorsville. In Nelson's autobiography, Serving the Republic, he writes, "While riding down the line at Chancellorsville, one of the enemy's bullets struck my metallic belt plate with great force. This caused a slight deviation as it entered the body. The result was an instant, deathly, sickening sensation. My sword dropped from my right hand. My scabbard and belt dropped to the left. I was completely paralyzed below the waist. My horse seemed to realize what had occurred. He stopped, turned, and walked slowly back, I holding to the pommel of the saddle with my hands." In response to his wounding, General Hancock wrote, "If Colonel Miles lives, he will be one of the most distinguished officers in the service." Miles was fully expected to die, though, and the Chancellor House, where he was being treated, also caught fire, nearly leading to his death. But he was evacuated and taken to Washington, D.C., where he was still expected to meet his demise. But his brother traveled down from Massachusetts and took him home. Once home, nearly 2 weeks after his wounding, the bullet and fragments of his fractured hip were extracted, and he quickly made a recovery. Within weeks, Miles returned to serving the Union Army and fulfilled Hancock's prophecy. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1892 for his actions at Chancellorsville. The citation reads, "Distinguished gallantry while holding with his command an advanced position against repeated assaults by a strong force of the enemy, was severely wounded." After his recovery, Miles returned to active service. The once lieutenant of volunteers was now a brigadier general, and he was quickly promoted to major general and placed in command of the 1st Division of the 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, the largest division in the Army at the time. Miles and his men were critical in cornering Robert E. Lee, compelling the surrender of his army and bringing the war to a close. At war's end, Miles was placed in command of Fort Monroe, where Confederate President Jefferson Davis was held prisoner. Miles famously put him in chains. After the Civil War, Miles, still in his mid-20s, entered the regular U.S. Army as a colonel. In that period, he would have owned these 2 swords here. He took command in the American West on the frontier and led U.S. forces during the Red River War, and then chased the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne towards the Canadian border after Custer's defeat at the Battle of Little Bighorn, compelling many of them to surrender. Miles' men then turned their attention against the Nez Perce, and he famously accepted the surrender of Chief Joseph. By the 1880s, Miles has clearly established himself as a military leader capable of compelling the surrender of even the most fierce Native American leaders. Thus, he was tasked to complete a mission multiple other commanders had failed to do, capturing and compelling the surrender of Geronimo. The famous Apache leader surrendered officially to Miles on September 4th, 1886. Around that time, Miles would have been presented this knife here at the front. I'm gonna go ahead and pick this one up so you guys can kind of see some of the details on it. If I turn it around this way, you can see that there is a very detailed carving of a Native American on the pommel here. I personally believe that that is probably meant to be Geronimo. If you look at photographs of Geronimo and then look at this carving, it looks very similar to him. And then on one side, you've got crossed cavalry sabers, and on the other side, you've got a pair of crossed rifles. So a very interesting presentation knife to Miles. It's inscribed here with his initials on the silver band around the base. After capturing Geronimo, Miles was sent in 1890 back to the Northern Plains. There he was faced not with a Native American uprising, but a religious movement. He was faced by the Ghost Dance movement, which many Native Americans believed would revitalize their communities and bring back the game, their ancestors, and basically reestablish their old way of life on the plains. Miles understood that the problems in the plains were not solely the responsibility of the Native Americans there. He wrote to his superiors in Washington that tensions between the whites and the Native Americans were largely due to Congress not fulfilling its treaty obligations and providing sufficient rations and provisions to the tribes, which led to them committing depredations against the settlers. Miles positioned his troops in the region to try to maintain the peace. Instead, when the Indian police went to arrest Sitting Bull to try to stamp out this Ghost Dance movement, several of his followers resisted. In the process, Sitting Bull was killed, along with several of his followers and several of the Indian police. The death of Sitting Bull threw fuel on the fire and inflamed the tensions. Many of his band members left and joined with Spotted Elk and then headed towards the Pine Ridge Reservation. Miles ordered the 7th Cavalry to intercept them. The conjoined bands were largely women and children, but there were warriors amongst them and they were armed. So the 7th Cavalry surrounded them and compelled them to disarm. In the process, one of the Native American warriors, who was reportedly deaf, struggled with the soldiers over handing over his Winchester lever-action rifle, and in the process, the gun went off. Within seconds, the situation devolved into wholesale slaughter. When the gunfire ended, 31 soldiers were killed, along with hundreds of the Lakota. Nelson Miles was not on the scene for the incident, but quickly arrived to evaluate the situation. Miles wrote that Wounded Knee was the most abominable military blunder and horrible massacre of women and children. He relieved Colonel James W. Forsyth of command and immediately launched an investigation. Despite his efforts, Forsyth was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, and 20 of his men instead received the Medal of Honor. And despite the government largely tamping down the situation, it was immediately clear to the public what had happened, and Wounded Knee was very quickly recognized as a massacre. Even late into his military career, Miles continued to lobby on behalf of the Lakota survivors. So this revolver in front of me here it's a really interesting piece. It's been called by some the first commemorative Colt single-action army. And if you take a look, this is why. On the barrel, it's inscribed Secret Service, 1898, Fort Wingate, and Wounded Knee. So it's commemorating multiple events in American history, including the Wounded Knee Massacre. And then back here, on the backstrap, it's inscribed Captain J.R. Hegeman. Hegeman might be recognizable to some collectors as he was one of the early collectors of American firearms, including Colts. We also have Hegeman's sword here that is inscribed to Captain Hegeman. Hegeman was an officer in the New York National Guard. He was also a very wealthy man. His father was the president of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. As I said, he's going to come back into the picture in a second, but let's kind of get back to that as it works into Miles' story. In 1895, Miles was promoted to Commanding General of the U.S. Army, the 10th and final man to hold that prestigious title. In that role, he led the U.S. military during the Spanish-American War and personally led the invasion of Puerto Rico and served as Puerto Rico's first governor under American rule. Now, people familiar with the firearms of the Spanish-American War may remember that Roosevelt's Rough Riders were partially armed with Winchester 1895 carbines. We have two 1895 carbines here before me. The one at the front was actually Hegeman's. He ordered this one for himself. And you can see it's a very deluxe Winchester carbine. This gun alone is already incredibly rare, even if you ignore the fact that it's Hegeman's, because it's got a matted barrel, it's got deluxe wood. You can see the top of the handguard here is not cut for a rear sight because this gun was ordered with a peep sight, another rare feature. And then you can see it's also got a really interesting series of kill notches all along the comb and down here along the bottom of the butt. We don't know exactly what those are from, but I presume they are from Hegeman hunting with this gun and keeping track of his kills. If so, he obviously used this gun a lot. The second carbine is Miles. It was presented to Miles by Hegeman. And again, it's a very rare piece. You do not see a lot of presentation Winchester 1895 carbines, let alone one presented to the man in charge of the US Army. This is the only one that that's the case for. And you can see right here on the side, it's inscribed in gold, Major General Nelson A. Miles. The gun would have been presented around 1899. And what's kind of interesting about that is Miles became the commanding general in 1895. Up until 1899, he was still a major general, and there were other major generals in the Army. Political complications had prevented him from being promoted to lieutenant general, which was the highest rank available at the time. The following year, in 1900, Miles finally attained that rank, lieutenant general of the US Army, a rank first held by George Washington. In 1903, Miles was hitting the mandatory retirement age. Without congressional or presidential interference, he would not be allowed to stay in command of the US Army. To prove that he was perfectly capable of still leading men into combat, Miles actually undertook an incredible task. As he approached his 64th birthday, he made a 90-mile ride from Fort Sill to Fort Reno over the course of just 10 hours and 20 minutes to show that he was still physically capable of leading the Army. The feat has been noted as the longest horseback ride ever made by a commanding general of the United States Army. When he hit his 64th birthday, he was compelled to retire because neither Congress nor the president intervened to allow him to stay in command. Nonetheless, when World War I broke out, Miles was now in his 70s, and he again volunteered to serve as a general in the US Army, but due to his age, he was turned down. In 1925, Miles died while at a circus in Washington, D.C. with his grandchildren. At that point, he could look back on decades of service to his country. In his autobiography that I referenced earlier, Serving the Republic, aptly named, his General Orders number 116, in which he said farewell to the Army, are included. He notes, "Unswerving devotion to our government and the principles upon which it was established and has been maintained is essential to the efficiency of the national forces, and especially is this so in a democratic government where the individual, in order to be a perfect soldier, must first be a true citizen." General Miles was certainly the latter. Nelson Miles, the 10th and last Lieutenant General of the US Army, had an incredible career, as we've covered, spanning from the American Civil War into the Indian Wars, through the Spanish-American War, and into the early 20th century. A man whose life truly was dedicated to service to our country, and it's represented through each of these items that are going to be available in our upcoming May premiere auction. Any one of these pieces is an incredible piece of Miles' legacy and his history, and is an incredible collectible to add value and interest to any American collection. As a whole, though, you can totally see how this collection is an incredible rare opportunity. We so rarely get the opportunity to offer individual pieces as amazing as some of these, let alone an entire archive of items directly related to and helping tell the story of this influential and iconic figure in American history.